You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 30th of May 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, we get an update from South Africa after presidential elections held there yesterday. And we'll head to Hong Kong for the conviction of more than a dozen pro-democracy activists. We'll also get the latest business news, and then
it would be very interesting to see what happens next, because if there is a shift rightwards of the European Parliament, it's going to be interesting to see what Meloni is going to do.
We'll hear from Italy in our latest European elections installment. And finally, it is Thursday, which can really only mean one thing. Fernando Augusto Pacheco in studio for the Global Countdown. Where are we counting down from, Faye?
Hello, Chris. Today we're heading to Mongolia to find out more about their incredible music scene.
All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. We will start in South Africa, which held elections yesterday that could be the most significant since the end of apartheid. Keen-eared listeners will know we've been following this across our shows today and throughout this week. But joining us for a quick update is Ferial Haffajee, Associate Editor of the Daily Maverick. Ferial, it is still early days in terms of the results, so perhaps first just tell us what we know about turnout. Was there excitement yesterday?
I think there was tremendous excitement yesterday, very long queues. We'll have a final turnout figure later today. The elections body was projecting a turnout higher than the last national election, which is higher than 66%. But my colleagues are reporting this morning that it in fact may be lower than that. So the queues were more the results of devices that didn't work and some problems at the voting station, rather than a higher turnout. But like I say, it will clarify later today.
Were there major frustrations, can we say, about that? How difficult were some of the issues around the voting?
It got quite heated in some places, like in Thokoza, which is near Johannesburg, where I live. But on the whole, I'd say that the bigger picture is of patient and resilient South Africans who, once they got into the queues, stayed often for up to 6 hours, on average 2.5 hours, in order to make their mark. I must say that perhaps I was an outlier. I was in and out in 7 minutes and 40 seconds.
That is good timing for you as a busy journalist covering these elections.
Yes.
In terms of the results, I do understand we probably won't get final results until the weekend, perhaps even Sunday. But do you have some indications so far, particularly, of course, the key question being whether the ANC, the African National Congress, will indeed lose their majority?
So it's very early days. As you say, I've just come back from the big results wall, and we have about 20% of voting districts in now. But that excludes the major towns. Ours is a very urban country, so we're still waiting for big towns and cities to report. Our election analyst at the Daily Maverick, Wayne Sussman, he has projected an outcome for the ANC at under 50%. He's projecting for 45%. That tallies with a couple of other key and very reliable sets of projections, all of which put the ANC at coming in under 50%. That's going to mean huge things for our country, because it's the first time the governing party will have come under a majority.
Absolutely. And I mean, as I understand, they will only basically have, if the ANC doesn't indeed come below 50%, they will have only about 2 weeks to reach a coalition deal. Is that even doable given the sort of divisiveness with the ANC, between the ANC and some of the other parties?
So it is doable. We've done it before in the local government election in 2021. As a citizen of Johannesburg, it doesn't result in the best outcome because you don't have substantially enough time to put the best people in place to make sure you've got the right people in the right portfolio. So the other idea that's very quickly gaining currency, and personally it's one I think will be better for South Africa, is the government of national unity, where parties which reach a threshold, and I've heard a number of 10%, they form a government of national unity, which is not a formal coalition. It's more like a cooperation agreement. That's the method we use in 1994 when our political transition happened.
Ferial, thank you very much for joining us. We'll continue to get updates from South Africa today and through the week as results come in. That was Ferial Haffajee. You're listening to The Briefing. Now, before we get to the news, we'll head straight to Hong Kong, which has seen the most significant use yet of China's national security law. 14 Hong Kong activists have been found guilty of subverting the state, including journalists, former lawmakers. Those 14 being part of the so-called Hong Kong 47, who have been charged with trying to overthrow Hong Kong's government in a wave of pro-democracy protests back in 2019. Well, joining me for more is Shibani Matani, international investigative correspondent at The Washington Post and author of Among the Braves, a story of Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. Shibani, welcome back to the program. This verdict was presumably expected, but it is nevertheless a pretty big moment, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. And I think even when you say it's expected, there was a big group, right? As you say, 47, of that 47, 16 of them decided to challenge, right? And challenge this case entirely and pled not guilty. I think, there was a thinking or hope that maybe half of them, maybe more might be found not guilty at the end. And the fact that there was only 2 of them that were acquitted, and actually immediately after the 2 of them were acquitted, Hong Kong's Justice Department sought to appeal that verdict as well, I think really shows you quite how total, right, the crushing of the democracy movement has been. There were so many moderates among this batch of people, right, people who would not really have registered as radical at all on the scale of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. And I guess that's why it is so crushing, and it is a huge blow.
And tell us about sort of the ruling, the finding of guilty, and what happens to them now.
Yeah, so the finding, the guilty verdict, basically what the judges said is that all of the defenses that they put up, and there were a range, right? All the different, defendants put up different defenses, including that the crime itself was vague, that the crime itself has been poorly defined by the state, which obviously has always been the criticism of the national security law in the first place, right? That how was anyone supposed to know what these crimes were when they were introduced the way they were by Beijing, right? And it was just hoisted upon Hong Kong, and these are all the first kind of batches of trials that are testing it, right? But all of that was basically, rejected. And some of the defendants said that they weren't, going to go as far as the government alleges. They weren't planning on, subverting the state or challenging state power in that way. That was also kind of rejected. And I think the jurisprudence actually sets like a really bad marker for Hong Kong's, legal system and Hong Kong's, entire way of interpreting the law, right? Because it's actually the most harsh, version or variation that they could have taken. So what happens to them now? The 14 who were found guilty were immediately remanded. They were detained, and they have to await sentencing. And as we, remember, the sentencing range here could range anywhere between 3 years, but for the worst offenders could be life in prison. So I think everyone's just waiting to see what the sentences will be.
And what is the mood then, frankly, among the 14 and, for that matter, the 47 as well? I mean, again, this is something that is expected, and perhaps in the past there would have been mass protests at something like this, but there has been such a significant crackdown. Is there some kind of reaction? Are we hearing from these groups? What can we expect there?
Yeah, I mean, Hong Kong is really sort of extremely muted, right? Unfortunately, a lot of people did turn up to the court today, to show their support and so on. But the reality is, since these people have been locked up for more than 3 years now, Hong Kong has passed even more national security legislation, right? Just in March, they passed a new additional laws as well that further, curtailed what remaining space there was in Hong Kong. They've even, banned a song that was related to the protests in 2019. I mean, if even playing a song is now deemed illegal, right? I mean, what can you sort of expect in terms of pushback? And I think the reality is, people really do feel very, very downbeat, right? And feel like they have just very, very little room to maneuver, very little room to push back. And no matter what, the defendants here, they went through 3 years of trial. I think there was a hope there for some of them that having gone along with the system, sitting in that court day in and day out, having lawyers that argued the case, there might have been a better outcome, but there hasn't been.
Now, this does have an international dimension to it, of course, as well, not only with the UK's involvement in the past with Hong Kong, but also specifically here because an Australian citizen is among those convicted. How has Australia responded to that?
Yeah, definitely. So Australia has expressed, very serious concern about the verdict today. There were diplomats from all over, the sort of Five Eyes nations, the EU, and so on, observing the trial, today in court and observing the verdict as well. But yeah, I mean, I think the reality is, there has been a real loss of faith in Hong Kong's legal system, in Hong Kong's judiciary, and you really see that manifesting not only, among the traditional sort of like pro-democracy folks or whatever, but also in terms of the business community, right? And a lot of businesses have chosen to relocate from Hong Kong. A lot of businesses have left. Tech companies, anyone worried about data security, anyone, worried about due diligence and what that could land them into. And I really think that there's been, a real sort of erosion in the trust, right, that Hong Kong courts will sort of, be the way they were before Beijing has sort of come in and rewritten the rules.
Well, and given that erosion of trust, I just wonder if this shifts to kind of a different dimension at this point, particularly for the international community. Do you imagine there might be any efforts to free some of these prisoners, particularly also, say, the fact that there is a foreign citizen of Australia who is convicted and potentially jailed as well?
Yeah, I think the really difficult and unfortunate thing is that the way, China, Beijing has crafted this law and the way they recognize dual citizenship is basically to not recognize it as long as you're a Hong Kong sort of permanent resident or you're a Hong Konger by their definition or a Chinese citizen or whatever, right? And so I think the efforts would be extremely, extremely difficult on that front. Obviously, the US has sanctioned Hong Kong in the past, but that hasn't really changed the course of the way things have gone there at all. So yeah, I think it sort of remains to be seen sort of what steps could be sort of effective in sort of stemming the kind of tide of the direction that Hong Kong is going in, right? And I think that's a very difficult question.
Well, and then just finally, Shibani, when you do bring up things like sanctions, have you made anything of the global reaction today beyond Australia? Do you expect anything else in that sense, whether it's sanctions or some other kind of response from the UK or others?
Yeah, and again, that's sort of a difficult question because I think so many governments are sort of at the stage of actually trying to re-engage with Hong Kong. You see the Finance Secretary Paul Chan actually in the US, in California this week, pushing, business ties and so on. And, the UK is obviously having their own sort of reckoning with the fact that so many Hong Kongers are there now after, what happened in the protests. And there was a recent spying case, right, that 3 people were charged for spying against the Hong Konger community. So I think all governments are now having to grapple with the reality of like this changed Hong Kong and sort of have to thread the needle much more carefully between, what they continue to want to do, right, which is engage and have business and so on. But the reality of the fact that this government has changed dramatically, right, and is now, jailing people pre-trial and not and spying on its own citizens overseas and so on, right? It's a transformed place.
Thanks very much, Shibani. That was Shibani Matani. Now here's Paige Reynolds with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Iran today began the formal registration of presidential candidates ahead of a snap vote next month to replace the late Ibrahim Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash. The elections were originally slated for 2025, but were brought forward following Raisi's unexpected death on May 19th. Presidential hopefuls will have 5 days to register. A mayoral candidate was fatally shot in southern Mexico last night during a campaign rally, just days before Mexicans go to vote in a general election. The attack is the latest in a string of attacks on candidates ahead of the weekend's vote. At least 22 people running for local office have been murdered since September 2023, with non-governmental organisations putting this figure at around 30. And after 5 years of work, the Champs-Élysées Committee has listed 150 proposals to bring Parisians back to the iconic street that has struggled with over-tourism. Endowed with a budget of €5 million, the committee has suggested adding green spaces, reducing pollution and organising cultural events to revive the famed avenue. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Paige. It is time now to get the latest business headlines with Bloomberg's Ewan Potts, who joins me now on the line. Ewan, let's start with right here in the UK. The general election is underway. It's been about a week at this point, and we have a warning about the state of the country's finances.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, 1 week down, 5 to go in the UK general election. Plenty of promises and pledges from the political parties, as you expect in an election. Promises on all sorts of things, pledges to spend money. Well, there's a blunt message from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which, if I may summarise it, is there is no money. The challenge awaiting the next winner, they say, is that the government is facing a situation with its fiscal headroom, which is at least as bad as the 1950s. So it's a fiscal challenge, a government spending challenge, which is at least as bad at any time over the last 70 years. Both parties have pledged to stabilise the debt burden, which is now close to 100% of GDP. That doesn't put it in the highest in the world. Italy and France have higher debt burdens, and Japan certainly, but it is a lot higher than it used to be in the UK after all that spending on the pandemic and the energy crisis. Debt has increased markedly over the last 20 years or so. But the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, says that whoever wins will be hemmed in by those high debt interest costs and low growth. And it says to rely on growth, improved growth, coming to the rescue is, it calls would be miraculously lucky. So there is a difficult fiscal challenge facing the next political party to win the general election. In fact, it says that the last time the government was in a primary surplus, that's a surplus after ignoring interest payments, was a full 23 years ago. So a pretty tough inheritance for whichever party wins on July the 5th.
Ewan, just to follow up on that, I mean, have markets responded at all? I mean, presumably none of this is a surprise, even if this report is sounding pretty dire, the fact that the UK has no money. But presumably people did kind of see that coming.
Yeah, it's all priced in, really. In fact, it's both priced in that the UK has no money. And that was, of course, the problem with the Liz Truss mini-budget, because markets knew that the position of the government was stretched. So when Liz Truss's government decided to spend a lot of money, cut taxes very rapidly without notifying the markets, that was what caused the markets to blow up. But in terms of the situation now, that is priced in. In fact, a Labour victory in the election is also priced in, because that is what the opinion polls are pointing to. Of course, whether that comes to pass is another matter. And if the situation on July the 5th is looking like it will be not a Labour majority, it will be a hung parliament or perhaps a Conservative majority, that would be a shock to the markets. So at the moment, they're fully pricing in a Labour victory, because that is what the opinion polls are pointing to.
And when you say pricing in, just quickly on that too, is there a sense then that Labour at least will be a relatively steady pair of hands? Have they are markets expecting that what they will do with this fact that there is no money will be turning out vaguely okay in the end?
Yeah, well, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have gone to enormous efforts over the last few years to court both the markets and the business community. So they have done everything they can to reassure markets and key businesses that Labour are not the scary Labour Party of 5 years ago under Jeremy Corbyn. So I think markets are fairly sanguine about that prospect, because, if you like, the pitch has been rolled for what a Labour government will do. And of course, with the lack of fiscal headroom, they really can't do anything too radical when it comes to public spending.
Ewan, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. Now to our continuing series ahead of the European Parliament's elections next week. Today we head to Italy, where Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has been playing a careful balancing act between the centre and far right in Europe and put herself at the top of her Brothers of Italy party's list for the elections, even though she has no intention of joining the EU Parliament herself. Monocle's Ed Stalker spoke to Marilisa Palumbo. She's the foreign editor of the Italian daily Corriere della Sera.
So usually voter turnout in European election in Italy is quite high. It's always been. The only thing is like last time in 2019, voter turnout was lower, almost 3 points lower, and it was a reverse trend compared with the rest of Europe where voter turnout was higher. I think that there was a period of time where people didn't really care about Europe. And then the last 5 years have shown that we need Europe, because nobody could expect in 2019 that we would have a pandemic and a war. And what Europe has done in regards to the Russian aggression and the pandemic has shown that we really need Europe. So now I guess people care more. According to polls, the main concern for Italian voters is usually the economy, which is not surprising. I guess that it's the same everywhere. The thing is that we are not talking a lot about economy in this campaign, which is focused more on, for example, Ukraine and defense. So what Europe can do, should do, or shouldn't do. For example, we have been talking a lot about what Stoltenberg recently said about giving Ukrainian permission to use Western weapons to strike inside Russia. For example, Meloni, who is usually aligned with NATO, was very critical of this, and so actually was also the left. So in Italy, it's quite normal that politicians that have no intention at all of going to Brussels, of moving to Brussels, or they have other roles in politics or elsewhere, would run for European election. And that's because they gather a lot of consensus, or they hope to gather a lot of consensus. So this year, Meloni was, the most striking example, because Meloni is prime minister, so she wouldn't go to Brussels, but she wanted to make this vote about herself, and that's also the reason why she didn't only run and put her name on the list, but she also said to voters, you can write my name on the ballot, so you can write Georgia, vote Georgia. And that's the reason, because she really wants to test her consensus. So messaging in this campaign, it's interesting because most of the parties are talking about Europe. So there are parties that want more Europe and others that want Europe but less Europe, or done better, as Meloni says. And then there is Salvini. And Salvini is peculiar because he is running this very anti-European, Eurosceptic, even Europhobic campaign. And I think he's doing that because he's now the only one that has this agenda, because Meloni has shifted in a more pro-European approach, because she wants to align with NATO and with the United States and with European allies. So since she's been in government, she has changed tone compared to the past. And so Salvini is the only one that wants to gather whole Eurosceptics in Italy, and that's why with Lega he's running this very weird campaign where you see posters about Europe wanting us to eat crickets or to have the water cup attached to the bottle. So like an example of stupid, stubborn rules that have no meanings in his views, of course. And I think that the main candidate that he chose, General Vannacci, who has very extremistic views on immigration, on gays, on Europe, is the proof of this strategy, this very Eurosceptic strategy. So we will see, because there is a very interesting fight for the second place in the coalition, given that Brothers of Italy, Fratelli d'Italia will be first. Who's going to gather more votes? Forza Italia. without Berlusconi for the first time in a European election, or Salvini and the League. And they have two opposite visions because Forza Italia has always been a pro-European party. What's interesting is that Giorgia Meloni has been at the center of this sort of European romance that we have been reading about in the last few weeks. So she has built a very strong relationship with Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president that's running for a second term. And Ursula needs Meloni because probably, if the polls are right, the center-right and the right will gain more votes, and so the balance will shift a little bit, and she would possibly need Meloni's vote, even if not all of the European and conservatives ECR votes, but maybe only Meloni's votes. On the other hand, she has Marine Le Pen of Rassemblement National in France, and she actually recently gave an interview with our newspaper Corriere della Sera, with our correspondent Stefano Montefiori, where she asked Meloni to do a super group of the right, of the far right. And that's kind of embarrassing, I think, for Meloni, because she is now between two fires, and she has to, on the one hand, this makes her very important and very courted on both sides, but she has to be very careful then what she will choose. If she will go with what she has shown in government, so pro-European, friends of the United States, pro-NATO, or, doing a group with Marine Le Pen, it's another story, because Marine Le Pen is very close to Russia, she's Europhobic, and so that's, kind of embarrassing for Meloni, I think. It will be very interesting to see what happens next, because if there is a shift rightwards of the European Parliament, it's going to be interesting to see what Meloni is going to do, because, as I said before, she has shown this loyalty to the European Union and NATO allies and Biden, and her position regarding Ukraine has been the same as France, Germany, all the big European powers. And so if there is a shift to the right, what does she do? She goes back to her pre-government rhetoric, which was much closer to Russia, and it's going to be difficult after what she has done in the last months.
Marilisa Palumbo there, from the foreign editor of Corriere della Sera, speaking to Monocle's Ed Stalker. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And finally, it would not be Thursday's edition of The Briefing without our very own Fernando Augusto Pacheco joining us live in the studio for the Global Countdown. Good afternoon, Faye.
Good afternoon. Very good to be here, Chris.
Very good to be here, because you are particularly excited, I feel like, about this one. We're headed to Mongolia.
Yes, we're heading to Mongolia. One thing I discovered about music markets, Chris, don't look at populations. Mongolia, although they have a vast area, they have a fairly small population, but their music scene is incredible. Excellent hip-hop, amazing artistry there. I'm not sure. Maybe you would disagree with me.
Maybe I will disagree, but we will be hearing that. But are you excited in that sense? Would you like to visit? Do you get a feeling there is just this vibrant scene over there that people don't actually know much about?
I'll ask our editors. I think I should do a culture story, because I think there is a story in there. But we start at number 5. Perhaps the name of this artist is incredibly hard to say, but forgive me.
You're going to do it. Go for it.
I will go for it, as I usually do. His name is Sextat Sangao. Sorry, would you mind if I try it again?
Let's try it again. Let's try it one more time.
I want to be very respectful to this guy here. Sextagan Bogdad. I think I said it correctly. Featuring Bektor Petrovic and Fruity Becca with the song called Sex, which actually means sexy Mongolian. Shall we have a listen?
Шүршүртэн хотор хувц усаар зайлагдах, айлав тайлагдах, урд минь хайлагдах, хаяа хамт уртай айл гутга боловдох. Чи залхан миштэй baby do you miss me? Чи балхан гихтэ хондох чүний мүсгүй.
It flows. It's very smooth, and I was reading more about the artist. He mixes the traditional Mongolian sounds with modern beats. So some people call him avant-garde hip-hop.
That was quite modern, I will say. Like I didn't even hear that much necessarily Mongolian in that.
It's quite chilled, and I think people might be surprised. And I was reading about the history of hip hop in Mongolia. It arrived in the country in the late 80s, but I think certainly one of the top genres that perhaps young Mongolians are listening to it at the moment.
Well, I can tell you, my uncle has always loved listening to rap in foreign languages, so I think he might be adding Mongolia to his list.
Please send a link to the Global Countdown to your uncle, because I think he would love that. But we have traditional taste here as well. This is a more traditional ballad at number 4. And I have to say, Chris, most of the artists are from Mongolia, so they like their own music there as well. At number 4, we have Bayard Sango, yes, with Hair Ezente, which I believe means with love in Mongolian.
Is it just me, or would Mongolia do very well in Eurovision?
Oh my God, they need to start. Maybe they should send a letter to the EBU. I think they would do very well. And this track is traditional. You are my everything now, because my heart is singing. Love music in dreams and sleep. So he's definitely a romantic.
Fernando, we've gone from sex to love. What do we have at number 3?
Now I think it's time for some thuggery,
Sex to love to thuggery.
Yes.
Why not?
Why not, I wonder if number 3 is the gangster rap version from Mongolia. It's a little bit different than the hip-hop from number 5. It's a little bit punchier, perhaps, if you look at the lyrics. Let's have a listen to Bakhter Petrovic, Fruity Baka, and Butterfly with Thugs.
That sudden high voice coming in did crack me up, but it's intriguing.
It's a bit naughty, the lyrics, but it's still smooth, right? So maybe it's not that gangster.
Have you had a look into the lyrics?
Yeah, I mean, because there's some parts in English and some parts in Mongolian. So there's a little bit of sex and thuggery, as I was saying.
Sex, love, thuggery. What could possibly be at number 2, Faye?
You mentioned Eurovision. I think from the 5 songs, I think number 2 is very Eurovision.
This would be the one they would submit.
She is a pop and R&B singer. She was discovered on The Voice of Mongolia, although she was only a quarter finalist. But that's what usually happens. The winners don't tend to do well, but the quarter finalists and the runner-ups, they are very good.
Can we just point out at this point, there is The Voice of Mongolia as well?
Yes, they love it.
It's everywhere.
And it's in the charts. This is Magnet Brain with her song, So Mantra.
I found my premiere, there was no doubt about it. If I say mine, it's already mine. If I say mine, you already mine. If I say mine, it's already mine.
And the visuals for her video, it looked expensive, the video. I wonder, Chris, because I was telling you that Mongolia doesn't have such a big population. I wonder if the neighboring countries consume Mongolian music.
Maybe that's something you have to answer for me, Fernando. I have not done this research.
From the number of views on YouTube, I gather that yes, the neighboring countries are listening to those artists as well. So the music's traveling a bit.
Well, we will try to get this beyond the regional into the global scene. Is that our goal with this countdown today?
Maybe I will add to the playlist. Maybe the number one song I think is actually, it's so cute. I say cute. It's about love, but about pain as well.
Gone back to love and pain.
And pain. There is a little bit of pain. I mean, even the name of the band is the Royal Heartaches. And the song is called 6x6. Let's have a listen.
Very sweet sounding, I think we can say.
Very sweet. And they have a new album out, and I think the launch party will be in a fancy hotel in Ulaanbaatar, but tickets are sold out. So sorry, even if you're in Ulaanbaatar, it's going to be quite hard to get those tickets.
Well, maybe we can get you there, Faye, for your culture trip to Mongolia.
I think so as well.
That was Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco with the Mongolian charts for us this week. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Paige Reynolds. Our researcher was George Ruskin, and our studio manager was Tamsin Howard. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.